everyone. My name is Rebecca. Welcome to Global One Voice Empowerment Network. Today we are super excited because we have a guest, and that is Miss Rabe. And our topic for today is going to be how we can break the silence and basically understanding and overcoming domestic violence. So, Miss Rabe, we're really so excited to have you because this has been a very long preparation, and finally you're here. I'm really super excited, and I am hoping to learn more about domestic violence. And before we start, I just want to give you some few minutes to share with us basically what you do and basically overall about domestic violence. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Rebecca. I am more than honored to be here today. I've been so excited for this. Just a little bit about myself. So I currently work with student employees, those from like low-income serving families who have an unmet need in college to help them gain experience and jobs while they're kind of on their path through college. It's been so rewarding. I myself was a low-income student growing up, so being able to go through and give that back and show what a program like this can do has been just amazing. I do have my an associate's in human services technology, as well as a bachelor's in counseling preparation, specifically in domestic violence and substance abuse. And while it's not a field I am currently in, it's something that I do hold near and dear to my heart as a survivor myself.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sure you're impacting so many people. So since our topic for today is how we can break the silence, so I'm curious today. For sure I'm going to learn a lot today. So I have this question, and that is, what are some common signs of domestic violence that people might overlook, and how can friends or family members recognize these signs? Mostly like people whom you work with, your co-workers, because sometimes really like you wake up very early in the morning and go to work and come back very late when everybody's tired. So they won't be able to see these signs, but like how can the people who are around you really like recognize that you're going through something?
Yeah, I think that's part of the thing. When we think domestic violence, I think a lot of people go to that physical space, the hitting, seeing bruises, maybe things like that. I think that's what a lot of people's kind of first vision might be whenever they think of domestic violence. But really, there's so many other areas that encompass it. So that could be something like controlling behaviors. So that could be limiting their mobility. Maybe they don't allow them to drive the car, that their abuser is the one driving them to and from work or wherever they're going. It's really typical to see them start to pull them away from their family. So controlling is just one of those abuse factors. So I don't want you to see them, or they'll start saying things about the family like, oh, well, your mother says these things and they don't like me. I don't think that you should go and be with them if they don't like me. They'll start to say things like this, or start driving you away from your family in that kind of way. It's even things like controlling food. So maybe you notice, speaking of like the friends and family side, maybe you like a decrease in weight all of a sudden. That's maybe not a healthy weight, because that's something else abusers will do. They'll control food, money, healthcare, and really not give access to those things. And that's financial is another, again, one of those pieces. I know just in my own personal experience, I was with one of my abusers, and we worked at the same location. And you had to go in to physically pick up your paycheck. It wasn't sent or direct deposited. You physically had to go pick up a check. And so we would go in together because they had to hand me the check. They would hand me the check, and as soon as we were out that door, the check was out of my hand. So that's something that others can experience too. The decrease in self-worth, if maybe they're feeling a lot less confident, if maybe you have a coworker who was very confident and then all of a sudden they're maybe questioning themselves, or I don't know if I'm good at this, or no, I don't think I can do something like this. You might hear those kind of quotes coming from them. Something that would be harder for a coworker, but just someone from themselves to kind of feel. Because I know for myself personally, in one of my stories, I wasn't aware that I was being abused. I was going through a lot of the symptoms, physical included, and I didn't know until I was sitting in a class one day and in a domestic violence class, and I was checking off all the boxes of all the things that were happening to me. And that was my, come to realization moment. But even things like sexual. So forced, like non-consensual sex
Yeah,
is something
yeah,
that
yeah.
happens if you're saying no, or even if you have a fear of saying no whenever like you have to have sex. They could be trying to give you an STI. They're like, I'm not going to use a condom. Maybe they're trying to get you pregnant. Those are all symptoms and signs that, you know, people might see. Stalking is another really big one.
Yeah.
Especially if you are maybe in a space. There are a lot of relationships that are the on off again, and maybe in one of those off periods there's stalking that could be involved too. But more specifically, talking about what friends and families, if there's someone making excuses for their injuries, for that bruise, or, oh, I hit a door, or I ran into this, I ran into that. Now, someone who does bruise pretty easily and run into doors all the time because I'm not paying attention, it's definitely something. But if it's, you know, not common areas, or you're noticing things like the wrist or the neck or things like that, you might be a sign. Again, that personality change, someone who might have been really confident and just excited and extroverted, and now they're kind of keeping to themselves. If they're constantly having to check in with a partner, so like, oh, I have to call my partner, I have to tell them this, I've got to check in now, oh, it's been an hour, let me call them real quick, I got to tell them where I'm at. Or even something down to like the clothes that they're wearing as well. So maybe it's summer, it's hot here in, you know, in Arizona, it's like 105.
Yeah, that's true.
Wearing these thick hoodies, long sleeve, long pants all the time. Those could be some signs that people can see. And really, as a supportive family member, some things that people can do would be asking those questions, ask if anything's wrong, showing your specific concerns, saying, hey, I think you're being abused, I think this is what is going on, and really just providing that space to sit there and listen to what they have to tell you, and be supportive of their choice. I know for me, it took a long while for me to be ready to leave.
Yeah, it takes a long time with most people as well, because like some people, like maybe it's gonna end, maybe everything's gonna be fine in 2 weeks, but then by the end you realize it's already 5 years, you know?
Yes, and it goes by what feels like so slow and so fast at the same time.
Yeah, that's true.
And I know I had very caring people in my life who were like, you need to leave, you need to go.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, it's okay, like, it's gonna be fine.
You're just hoping that everything's gonna be fine, Yeah,
and especially because, you know, when they are separating you from your family, like, that becomes the person you love.
Yes.
And that's part of what they're doing, is when that is the only person in your life that loves you, as they try to tell you, where else do you go? Why would you listen to someone else who's been in your life, maybe? Because now this person has controlled you mentally for so long.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, so like realizing those signs is kind of like sometimes it's really very hard, but like what you say is like, I think the main thing here is seeing the changes. Like if you see something's really changing in someone's life, somebody was a good public speaker and all of a sudden everything's changing, so you must really question and find a way of supporting this person, because most of the time like people won't realize that it's a problem until like it has maybe taken some good time, like many years, then they'll realize like, maybe I think this is a problem, and yet you could have served the person on day one, you know, like, oh, in 2 weeks time. And the other thing that I'm curious about is like, how does domestic violence impact the mental and emotional health of survivors, and what are some effective strategies for healing and recovery?
So there are lots of ways that can affect you, even years, decades down the line. Especially depending on how long you were in a relationship, how deeply you were controlled by your abuser. I mean, little things, even like making like just day-to-day decisions, can be hard. You might be in a constant state of fear if there's loud noises or bangs, or even if someone maybe slightly raises a voice, that could be something enough to have this triggering effect on you, to cause your body to want to shut down. It has huge just impact on mental health too, from things like depression, anxiety, PTSD. It could even cause people to go and use substances, so substance abuse can become a part, because they'll have these thoughts like, oh, well, if I'm going to be beat, it's going to hurt a little less if I'm high, or, you know, it's an escape, you're trying to escape this reality, so people might turn to substance abuse. And really, one that not a lot of people that I hear talk about is this chasing to get back to yourself, which is something that I know I've personally struggled with, of, you know, when you come out and you're in this process of recovering, like, oh, I want to get back to my old self. What was my old self before? And it's sometimes realizing that you have fundamentally changed. changed. And if you were in like a long 5-year relationship, you're not the same person who you were 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's okay. It's okay. You're a new person. You're this new, when you think about I love flowers, especially those perennial ones who you have this moment where they grow, they're beautiful, they die off, but then the next year they come back and they're beautiful again. And they might look a little different. The color might be a little different, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And it's okay to be a new person. It's okay to recognize what you've gone through and just show the strength that you have when you leave a relationship like this and you're in this process of really just trying to recover and survive.
Yeah.
And there are lots of different ways depending on like where you are, what that counseling might be an option for you, especially finding a counselor who's trauma informed. That would be one that I would usually recommend, so they can have that piece of knowledge coming
and experiences.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I personally look for whenever I'm looking for counselors, is someone who does have that trauma informed piece. And they're going to teach people to learn skills like recommunicating, managing your stress, reducing that feeling of isolation, especially if that's a piece that's been a large part of your abuse. And even like little things, like whenever you go to to different providers and doctors and OBGYNs, they will, in hospitals really in general, at least here in the States, they'll ask that question, do you feel safe at home? Be okay with answering no, because they have those resources to help you out.
So I know you've talked about like counseling, and so like what are other resources and support systems available for individuals experiencing domestic violence, and how can they access these resources safely? Because sometimes like they don't want to share what they're going through because they fear that something bad might happen to them.
Absolutely. And I think this is going to really depend on the individual person, what their circumstances are, where they're located. There are national organizations such as the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, Futures Without Violence. Internationally, you have organizations like Alliance for Hope International and Violence Against Women International. And even more on a local level, if we're not looking at those larger organizations, we can look at things like your local shelters, women's shelters, men's shelters, counseling services, of course. Religious organizations will sometimes have things that can help. I know here in the States we have the National Domestic Violence Hotline, so that 1-800-799-SAFE or 7233 that you can call. Sometimes it's local courts. I know that one's kind of scary sometimes to go in, but sometimes your local court system will have tons of resources. But really with all of that kind of safety piece is really you want to create a safety plan. So this is something you want to have thought out. But keeping in mind, of course, technology is not private. Just because you delete it or you have these phone calls, it can be trackable depending on the situation. So if you're sharing a phone plan and you're not allowed to have money, you're not allowed to pay bills, your partner is paying those things. So that could be using, if possible, a friend's information, a local library, somewhere with like local space that's maybe not your personal information that they can look up to. And creating those plans again from maybe a friend's house or somewhere local, but thinking about hiding a spare car key if you have access to your car still, packing a bag with those important things, money, medication, important documentation, maybe having a bag and keeping it at a trusted friend or family member, especially if in those later plans of leaving. Having code words. This is really important for people who maybe have kids who are going through the abuse with them as well. Having a code word of, when I say this, this is what this means. We have to get out. You need to call 911. You need to call, that trusted family member or trusted friend. And knowing where you're going to go and how you're going to get there. Those are some really important things. So having that plan in mind. So if something happens, this is what I'm going to do. And again, there's usually kind of a pattern that people see with domestic violence of, where things start to escalate and eventually go into, the abuse and then possibly a calm phase. But whenever you start to realize you're going into one of those arguments, even just making sure that you put yourself between your abuser and a door. Don't ever let them block your escape route if need be. And just trying to navigate that kind of space.
Wow, that's interesting. So, like, it's always very important to always have friends, like then having this smart plan. But I think this always come in when you already know that you're going through an abusive relationship or an abusive life. Then that's when you start to plan all those good plans. But like, it's always very important for us to have somebody who will always help us through this situation. So now, like, then how can communities and organizations, like, what roles can they play in preventing domestic violence and supporting survivors in their journey to recovery? Because like for you to go to a specific organization, like you must first have that friend of yours or somebody who recognize and help you through. So now, like, how can these organizations come in to support you?
I think really a part of it is just us in general, everyone in the nation internationally is really breaking down what the stigma is, what it means. There are sometimes, people who suffer domestic violence are always homeless, are always drug abusers, or always something, they always want to say something like that, but that's really not the case. It can happen to anyone, usually 1 in 4 women, and anywhere from 1 to 9 to 7 men can experience this. So really, it's unfortunately very common. Partner abuse, domestic violence is very uncommon. If you think about your friend group, 1 in 4, that is a really small number. And even 1 in 9 is a very small number.
That's
so
true.
As we talk about these things, making a space is what different communities and organizations can do, is to make space to have a conversation.
Yes.
Make it a part of something. Having preventative programs like a healthy relationship program, or children. So maybe even starting at that level, having these, this is what a healthy dynamic is. This is how we, have a healthy dynamic with our friends, our families, and continuing that type of program really all up through schooling. As they get into middle school, high school, how do we healthily have a relationship with partners, and really creating that space at a younger age, and having organizations that do that can be very handy as, us as we kind of navigate through our life cycle.
So basically, like creating awareness when people are still young, especially from a very young age. Like we have schools, I think that will also be a very good place to start from. Like they can have a session maybe once in a month, and they tell them, because like when you're aware of what's going on, or like when you're aware what's good and what's bad, like when you go through that situation, you'll always kind of like have those signs in mind and be like, I think here something is going to happen and we may not end up in a good way. So you start to prevent it at a very earlier stage. So we are coming to the end of our conversation. I'm really learning a lot. And how can we better educate people about domestic violence? I think we've already talked about that a little bit, but you can add more light on how we can educate people about domestic violence to break the cycle and encourage more victims to come forward and seek for help.
Yeah, and even just what you talked about too, starting these types of programs in schools.
Yeah.
So we start to know what the signs are when we're seeing it, or how do we treat people in a healthy way. And I think that's really education, talking about it, breaking the stigma down, and being able to have these healthy conversations, because it does happen, and not talking about it with any other sort of mental illness or anything like that. The less we talk about it and the more we shove it aside, the less people know about it. For me, in my own personal experience, I mentioned how I had no idea that I was suffering from this until there was a sheet of paper in front of me that said, this is physical abuse, this is financial abuse, this is emotional abuse. And I was like, check mark, until nearly every single one was check mark. For me to realize and sit there with myself after that, hey, this is what I'm going through. Like, someone had to tell me the signs to my face for me to realize that. So as we educate and we talk about people, and really just, it's a pattern we can see. So I know sometimes, like, even the word cycle is something that we can remove and talk about a pattern instead. Just because when cycle can be used as a victim blaming tool. Sometimes it talks about stage 4. It's the calm phase, and like, well, why didn't you leave during the calm phase if you just knew it was gonna happen? But
no, just like you're hoping everything will be better. I think that's always a problem. You're just hoping that something's gonna happen at least,
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's I know for me that's what I had thought. It'll get better this time.
Yeah.
They'll change. And sometimes it doesn't, and it does mean having to leave and start that process of having a safe plan to leave.
Yeah.
But really just talking about it and getting it out there, breaking the stigma, and just having those conversations from a young age. Even elementary school. Like these are things because children can go through this as well. This isn't something that's only, yes, adult relationships,
Yeah.
sexual relationships, this is where you're going to see it.
Yes.
But there are usually children in the home sometimes too that
Yeah.
have to witness this. And that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But really talking about it, breaking the stigma of it, is really how we start to talk about that, and letting people have this space to come forward and tell and share their stories.
Yeah.
Or if you are a survivor who is willing to talk about your story, having that voice to go through. I know one of the first times that I very publicly opened up about it was in a communications class in college.
Yes.
Where we had to pick a topic, pick a myth, and what I talked about was the myths of domestic violence and what people thought.
Yeah.
And that was my first time sharing my story in
Yes.
front of a very large group of people.
Yeah.
And I was able to have actually several other victims in the class come forth to me afterward personally,
Yeah.
who were survivors or in a situation currently, and how I was able to help them with some resources. So even just like speaking your truth, speaking your story
Yes.
can be something that can really help people kind of move forward and come forward on their own.
Yeah, that's
look
very
for
true,
help.
because most of the time we learn from experiences, and we learn from lived, like, true life experiences. It's always,
Yes.
rather than them giving you a paper, but like you tell him, like, I really went through this and this is what you can do, this is how I managed it. It's always help a lot. And so when you come out, but it takes a lot of courage, like it's not just something that you can just, but like just have that courage and come out and talk about it, because it's gonna help and impact. Like we have no idea who this conversation is gonna impact afterwards, So it's always
Absolutely.
very important. So we have come to the end of this conversation. Like, do you have something else you wanna share with the audience?
I think really if you have someone who is going through anything like this, again, be ready to be a helping hand, even if it's something just lending an ear for them to speak what their truth is or what they're going through, and be with them along the way. Don't try to lead, but walk beside them through this process, because ultimately they're going to be the ones that have to say, this is my time, and make that on their own choice, even though it can be very hard to watch. But being there and being supportive and walking beside is a lot better than, this is what you need. If you are someone who is currently in danger, please look for your local resources. Go to a library to look at these things. Use local, international, national resources that you have, and know that you will come out on the other side that new beautiful flower.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.